It's the Terrible Twos Part 2 on Seigaiden Episode 60. The Master System continues to fumble second efforts here with a disappointing sequel to one of the console's standout releases. Zillion 2 looks great, and it sounds good, but it carries forward none of its predecessor's strengths. The original Zillion admittedly fell pretty short on originality, effectively amounting to a pure knockoff of Epyx's Impossible Mission. Don't take this as a criticism. Being an Impossible Mission knockoff is no bad thing at all. On top of that, console kids in the late 80s didn't exactly have a buffet of options for playing games like Impossible Mission. Even though it was a genuine video game classic, it primarily appeared on home computers, not consoles. Console enthusiasts who wanted to dip into its secretive world of athletic computer hacking had to turn to the Atari 7800, a console whose sales performance made the Master System look like a towering commercial colossus. So Sega had their collective head on straight when they said, let's rip that off. Plus, Zillion added its own interesting elements to the template that it had swiped from Impossible Mission in order to modernize the concept to better fit the late 80s console space. For starters, it gave players a weapon to use against the bad guys, making it less a game about pure stealth and evasion, and one that incorporated a little more tactical action. Not only that, but Zillion's protagonists could power up their weapons as well, and you could also juice up the protagonist's jumping skill. Please note the apostrophe that comes after the S in protagonists here. In keeping with the television series it adapted, Zillion revolved around a trio of characters and allowed you to play as all of them. Assuming that you could live long enough to rescue the captive Apple and Champ anyway. The point is, Sega needed to create a game to tie in to a television series and light gun toy. And instead of going the obvious route of building Zillion as a light gun game, they created what amounted to an upgraded sequel to a classic American computer game. Well, you can see the problem with Zillion 2 right away. Rather than taking its cues from a PC masterpiece from the West, this game goes the most unimaginative route imaginable by simply aping Famicom licensed titles, like Super Dimension Fortress Macross and Transformers The Mystery of Convoy. I suppose if you want to be charitable, you could say it looks to minor arcade hit Formation Z for its inspiration. Or, even more fittingly, that it builds on Sega's earlier attempt to turn a mech-heavy cartoon into a console game. Orgus for SG-1000. This choice makes sense, albeit in a sort of trite, banal way. That's because all of the productions that inspired these licensed games, Orgus, Transformers, Macross, and yes, Zillion, trace their heritage back to animation studio Tatsunoko Productions. They were either produced directly by Tatsunoko Pro, as with Macross and Zillion, or else came from studios that splintered from Tatsunoko, namely Toei Animation and JC Staff. And all of these cartoons starred hot-headed young men with fluffy hair, saucer eyes, and an aptitude for using sophisticated combat weapons against evil alien forces. Well, I guess Transformers was fairly light on the fluffy hairdos, but, you know. What this means in video game terms is that Zillion 2 takes a much simpler approach to its design than its predecessor had. Gone are its non-linear exploration and code-breaking, the expansive character rescue and swapping mechanics, and the progressive upgrade system. In their place, we have a simple action game that alternates between auto and ratchet scrolling. You mostly play as fluffy-haired hero JJ, and swapping characters comes with a huge asterisk. But the auto-scroll levels do allow you to alternate between riding a bike and flying around with the bike transformed into futuristic body armor, assuming that you manage to collect the requisite icon to enable the transformation as it scrolls past. It's a perfectly tolerable arcade-style action game, and certainly does play more convincingly than Alex Kidd the Lost Stars. But seeing these two streamlined sequels in rapid succession really raises questions. Namely, why the simplification? Was this the result of Sega's overloaded internal development teams rushing as quickly as possible to churn out as many games as they could? Or was the company simply trying to create a greater sense of unity between its home and arcade efforts? The Master System couldn't match the output of a System 16 arcade board. Heck, it couldn't even really recreate the System 1. But maybe Sega was banking on the notion that people associated the company's name with a certain style of high-intensity, coin-gobbling experience, and wanted to do their best to recreate that ethos for the home audience. This is all speculation on my part, though. Who knows why Sega's internal 8-bit development staff did much of anything? Even the people who were there at the time seem pretty fuzzy on the details, which is understandable given the sheer number of projects they had to manage on such compressed timelines. But consider this, Master System sequels trend in the opposite direction of NES sequels. Nintendo Entertainment System has a reputation for having delivered loads of weird second entries in popular franchises. I think this reputation tends to be fairly overblown, but certainly the NES developer ecosystem had no fear of mixing things up when it came time to build a sequel to a popular game. The American Super Mario Bros. 2 is probably the poster child here, but consider also Donkey Kong Jr., Zelda 2, Castlevania 2, Ikari Warriors 2, River City Ransom, Wizards and Warriors 2, 1943, Bionic Commando, and, well, you get the point. All of these games stand apart from their predecessors by adopting a greater spirit of exploration, adventure, and even role-playing elements. And generally speaking, when those series managed to survive long enough to generate a third entry, those follow-up efforts usually walked things back to play more like the original entry in the series had, leaving the second game stranded as the weird outlier. But there was a real sense on NES that sequels meant greater depth and more sense of discovery. That is to say, games that embraced not only contemporary trends, but also engaged with the different play patterns that had emerged in homes versus the arcade. Zillion 2 and Alex Kidd the Lost Stars went the opposite direction. They sanded down the sticky exploration elements of the earlier releases in favor of a more straightforward style of play, pushing back against the RPG-flavored games that appeared to be everywhere on Famicom around this time. In effect, Sega's approach to sequels on Master System underscored the difference between their platforms and Nintendo's, and built toward the message that would become the company's marketing line during the 16-bit era. Sega offered arcade-style action, pure gaming twitchery, and none of that muddled, slowpoke Nintendo gameplay in its sequels. Even Fantasy Zone, which integrated more exploration, was still pretty fast-paced. On top of that, Master System's apparent move away from genre-bending action games toward pure tests of reflex actually puts it ahead of the curve versus Nintendo. As I've mentioned before, once Super Mario Bros. 3 arrived on Famicom, Famicom developers realized that consumers actually really enjoyed great action games on their own merits. No RPG shenanigans required. And the tide of console action design shifted away from the hybrid action RPG format in favor of straightforward shooting and platforming again. But Sega was already there, predicting trends and tastes. Well, almost. Zillion 2 isn't exactly Super Mario Bros. 3. As so often seems to be the case with 8-bit releases, Sega's hyper-compressed development timelines and small teams rear their terrible heads here. Zillion 2 does include some stages that resemble the original game if you don't look too closely, but that's only true for half of them. Play here alternates between two formats, run-and-gun shooter and auto-scrolling vehicular shooter. The game actually kicks off with the latter format, as you control JJ on his cool futuristic motorcycle, the Tri-Charger, not the Tri-Formation. An advanced combat vehicle that, despite its sophisticated design, lacks a brake to let you bring the forward scrolling to a stop. That's lowest bidder contracting for you. The motorcycle sequences involve a lot of jumping over pits and hazards while trying to maneuver between enemies and their projectiles. This is not made any easier to the civilized, modern mind by Sega's continued insistence on reversing the order of action buttons to put jump on the inside button. But I suppose if you were a kid whose mind had already been miswired by a few years of mixed-up Master System controls, this would have been no big deal. The bike scenes require a mix of twitch reflex, pure memorization, and patience. They like to throw a lot of stuff at you, often in ways that prove awkward to avoid if you don't know to expect those attacks, and frequently with the same movement and attack patterns repeated over and over again. So, pretty standard fare for the era. Zillion 2 mixes things up a little bit by tossing occasional icons around the scrolling stages that, when collected, allow you to transform your bike into powered armor. If you've played Transformers for Famicom or Formation Z, you know exactly what this means. You gain the ability to move around the screen instead of being stuck on the ground, but this power comes at the cost of presenting a much larger target profile to enemies. The greater precision allowed by the transformation doesn't necessarily balance out the fact that you're a much bigger target that will take an absolute beating from bad guys in return. So the transformation doesn't always pay off. Meanwhile, the even-numbered levels see you playing as JJ in a straightforward platform shooter. You move from left to right, or right to left, jumping, ducking, and shooting guys. You can't branch from the straightforward path ahead in these stages and have no choice but to continue marching forward. The only thing Zillion 2 really retains from the original game is the search and rescue element. Both Apple and Champ have been kidnapped once again, the careless knuckleheads, and you can recover them inside of not-so-hidden rooms in stages 2 and 4. Bringing your allies into the fold gives you, effectively, 2 extra lives. This only works in the auto-scrolling stages, and it requires you to juggle a second controller in order to bring up the character selection menu. You can only summon a rescued ally once, though, so this is way more limited than how it worked in the original Zillion. In keeping with the overall theme of the game, I suppose. Overall, Zillion 2 is fine. The controls are decent, the level designs and enemy placement are adequate, and the graphics look nice enough. In a way, I suppose it's fitting for this game to feel so lackluster compared to the original. It's a perfect parallel to how crummy the second half of the original anime was, compared to the impressive and beautifully animated first half. Still, you can't help but feel like Sega sacrificed something vital with the format change. Back in the day, my Sega-loving friends treated Zillion as counter-programming to the likes of Metroid and Blaster Master, games that proved the Master System had cartridges every bit as intricate as Nintendo's. With Zillion 2, that argument no longer works. There's no direct analog to Zillion 2 on NES, but when we had the likes of Contra and Life Force, who needed one? And what did Sega Vision say? My friends, I believe the technical term is couldn't be arsed. Next time on Segaiden, we break the streak at last.